here's what I am seeing, and this is, I could have predicted this because I've been doing chemistry for a few years now, and here's the way this works. Once I figured out that I needed to break up the naming stuff. People do really well at each piece of the naming. And then we throw it all together, and they freak out. And they struggle a little bit. So, the challenge, you know how to name a compound that is binary ionic. Let's see. So, 2 minus, 1 plus. We get Na2S. You know that that's sodium sulfide because it's a monatomic. Okay, great. You know all that. If I have Fe2 plus S2 minus, you know you have to crisscross charges. You know that's FeS after you simplify it. And you know because you have that ion reference sheet, you know that iron makes multiple ions. You know that when you name that thing, you have to specify which iron you're talking about. So you know that this is iron 2 sulfide, right? And you know that if I was to give you Na1 plus SO4 2 minus, you would do the same thing. You would crisscross. You'd get Na2SO4, and you know that that would be sodium sul. You can look at your ion reference. It helps. Not sulfide, sulfite. Good. So you know that that's sodium sulfite. Now the question is, here, and let's do one more thing. Whoops, and I just did it. Sodium sulfate. Sodium sulfate. Okay. Well, that's all good. And if I give you a compound that looks like that, SO, still got sulfur in it. Everything's had sulfur in it so far. Sulfur's now bonded to oxygen. What is this? Sulfur oxide? Sulfur monoxide. So, the question, monoxide. Really, I say that there are 4 systems for naming. Really, there are more or less 2. There are ionic naming rules and molecular naming rules. Because all of the ionic stuff is, naming the ions. And, if you see a metal, a transition metal, you know that you have to look for which ion it is. So you keep your ion, a lot of my students have taken to calling that their ion Bible. Keep your ion Bible handy and check that common D block elements, check that. If it appears on here, you have to specify a number. If part of it appears on the polyatomics, it's going to have a polyatomic name. How do you tell if it is molecular or ionic? Well, this is where we get into that East Coast, West Coast thing. So, when you look at those early compounds we did, we were talking about things like sodium plus sulfide, iron plus sulfate ion, iron plus sulfide, iron plus sulfide, sodium plus sulfate. Those are all East Coast, West Coast marriages. Okay? This is all things that have very different attractions for electrons. Remember, ionic bonding is going to happen between things that have very different electronegativities. And just even leaving out the sulfate for a moment here. These, and I'm making this really rough, are all metals. Sodium is a metal. We forget about that because we don't think of it as a metal. Calcium is a metal. Those are metals. A metal plus a non-metal is what gives you an ionic compound. When you have neighbors marrying neighbors, when they have a lot in common, they're going to have to share. They're going to bond covalently. So your covalent bonds are going to be things like carbon and oxygen, nitrogen and oxygen, oxygen and sulfur, you know, sulfur and any of the halogens. So the halogens they're so electronegative, they tend to bond ionically. But your moleculars are all going to be non-metals to non-metals. That's the big trick. The one tricky part of that is hydrogen, though it is in group 1, remember it's a weirdo, it's actually a non-metal. And you can think about hydrogen is not a metal, it's a gas. That's an easy way to remember that. That's really the whole big, great secret. Look at that periodic table. Are these things close neighbors? If so, they're going to bond covalently. You're going to use those molecular rules. You're going to use prefixes. If they're very different, if they're a metal and a non-metal, it's going to be ionic rules. The other thing is, if it has a polyatomic ion, it's automatically ionic rules. So that's 6 minutes, and that's as simple as I can make it. You need to have the mixed naming practice done and the mixed naming FIP done. And it is set on auto grade. So get that mixed naming FIP done before you walk in tomorrow. Tomorrow when you walk in, we will take the naming quiz, version 1. If you're absent, you'll just make it up. That's what I got for you.